In an Alpine region of southern Germany, an ordinary house was transformed into a center of absolute power. Adolf Hitler's mountain residence, located on the Obersalzberg, began as a private property and ended up becoming the symbolic heart of the National Socialist regime. For years, key decisions were made there, meetings with heads of state were held, and military campaigns were planned. In parallel, a second building was built on the summit of Kehlstein, at over 1,800 meters above sea level, as a display of technical strength and territorial dominance. Hitler's presence on the mountain was used as a propaganda tool, projecting an image of closeness, order, and grandeur. The war ended with the place bombed, looted, and finally abandoned. What was it really like to live at the top of the most surveilled and symbolic regime of the 20th century? The beginning of a presence that would not go unnoticed. Between 1880 and 1936, the Obersalzberg was one of the most popular holiday destinations in all of Bavaria. Amidst the boarding houses and inns, very old country houses lent the place a picture postcard feel. Among the important names who had private residences in this area were Professor Linde, the piano manufacturer Bechstein, and the businessman Winter, originally from Buxtehude. The centerpiece of the area was the Platterhof, a building that was also a key setting in the famous play Two People, written by Richard Voss. During the 1920s, many high society figures gathered in this area. In the winter of 1922 to 1923, one of the early ideologues of the Nazi Party, Dietrich Eckart, hid for a time in the Platterhof. It was Christian Weber, another of the movement's early activists, who finally managed to bring Hitler to Berchtesgaden in 1923 to meet Eckart. The latter had registered under the false name Dr. Hoffmann. Hitler, for his part, also used an invented identity, Mr. Wolf. The landscape of the Obersalzberg impressed him so much that he returned several times before being arrested for attempting a coup d'etat. After his release from Landsberg prison, Hitler asked the Buchner family, who rented a farm, to rent him a small wooden cabin located about 100 meters above the main boarding house. There, he was able to work in peace on the first part of Mein Kampf for extended periods. Meanwhile, Dietrich Eckart moved into a house known as Gollhäusl, where, now removed from the noise, he wrote poems and songs dedicated to the National Socialist movement. In 1926, the Platterhof changed hands and passed into the hands of the Dressel family, originally from Saxony. Hitler despised Dressel, calling him a first-class slacker, and from then on he avoided the Platterhof, claiming it offered poor food and an unpleasant atmosphere. During this time, he usually stayed at the Marienheim Antenberg or the Deutsches Haus boarding house in Berchtesgaden. It was there that he finished writing the second part of his book. In 1928, Hitler learned by chance that the house known as Haus Wachenfeld was available for rent. This small chalet was located in a meadow just below the Platterhof. Hitler already knew it from his long walks in the area. He decided to rent it for 100 Reichsmarks a month to its owner, Mrs. Winter. He lived there as a tenant until 1933. The house was managed by his half-sister, Angela Raubal, who had worked for him since 1928. During that time, Hitler invested considerable money in improving the home. He wanted to have these renovations notarized, perhaps to ensure he would recover some of the money if he ever sold the property. While on a propaganda trip, he took the opportunity to visit Mrs. Winter in her hometown of Buxtehude. During that visit, he offered to buy the house. Just upon arriving, he was told that the Winter family's leather factory had burned down by lightning the night before. Despite this, Mrs. Winter was delighted with the visit and immediately accepted Hitler's proposal. On June 26, 1933, the sale was signed for 40,000 gold marks. In addition to Hitler, other figures of the regime also began to settle in the area. Hermann Göring as Reichsmarschall and Martin Bormann, then Deputy Chief of Staff to the Führer, also acquired properties on the Obersalzberg. In 1936, the simple Haus Wachenfeld was transformed into what would later become known worldwide as the Berghof. The Obersalzberg became an increasingly prominent center of attention. In addition to Berlin, the official seat of government, this mountain was the site of many state visits and diplomatic meetings that shaped the course of international politics. Even in the most difficult moments of the war, the Obersalzberg maintained a tranquil appearance. But it was all a facade. Behind this Alpine landscape, Hitler made important decisions. far from the noise, with the calm he sought to draw up his plans. From the beginning, Bormann saw it as his personal obligation to transform the entire Obersalzberg to suit Hitler's tastes. He was directly responsible for all the radical changes that mountain underwent, and it's hard to imagine anything like that happening again in that place. From a cabin to a symbol of power, the birth of the Berghof. The Alpine cabin that a minor politician had rented in October 1928 became too small 4 years later, for the man who was already the leader of Germany's largest parliamentary party. Hitler's political rise and the number of people who accompanied him overwhelmed the house's capacity. In the fall of 1932, he commissioned the first of several renovations that would eventually transform the mountain chalet into a fortress of sorts. The original design, designed between 1916 and 1917, showed a fairly simple two-story structure. The ground floor contained a living room entered through a wooden porch, a kitchen with a pantry, a servant's quarters, and a bathroom. Upstairs were 2 large bedrooms at the front, 2 small ones at the back, and a full bathroom. In the spring of 1933, based on plans drawn up the previous September, a garage was built on the sloping ground directly below the house, creating a terrace above it. A winter garden projecting over this terrace replaced the old porch. Above this structure, the 2 front rooms received a larger balcony. To the right of the chalet, a long extension was built to house staff and guards, and the driveway was also redesigned and widened. Although Otto Dietrich, Hitler's press officer, claimed that his boss had drawn up the plans, the documents were signed by Josef Neumeier, a Munich architect and early party member. From the first rental agreement in 1928, Hitler had secured preemptive right of purchase over the property. The owner, Margarete Winter, an elderly widow living in Buxtehude, was reluctant to sell. But after a personal visit from Hitler, she changed her mind. On September 17, 1932, they signed an agreement setting the price at 40,000 gold marks. After being appointed Chancellor on January 30, 1933, Hitler's half-sister, Angela Raubal, attempted to adapt to the new demands of the household. Among the invoices saved from that spring and summer, one can see how she expanded the household inventory: plates, glasses, cooking utensils, dessert molds, lamps, and ornaments. The number of items for preparing sweets reflected Hitler's fondness for desserts. Curiously, 5 chamber pots were also purchased, perhaps for a newly completed wing that only had 1 shared bathroom for 5 rooms. The purchase of flowers, vines, shrubs, and gardening equipment shows a growing attention to the visual appearance of the surroundings. Despite all these improvements, the house still fell short of the number of visitors. A New York Times Magazine article noted that even important guests, such as Rudolf Hess, had to sleep in tents or above the garage. Hitler's personal aide, Heinz Linger, said that the dining room, which was a greenhouse, was so small that diners had to stack their plates after eating to assist the waiting staff. This lack of space was one of the reasons why Hitler, in the summer of 1935, decided on a radical expansion of the house. The work was completed in July 1936, and it was then that he renamed his home the Berghof. Albert Speer, in his memoirs, recounted that Hitler had not only made sketches, he had borrowed a drawing board, a set square, and other tools to make the plans, sections, and scale drawings of the project himself, without asking for help. Although Speer acknowledged that Hitler devoted great care to the design, he also said that he was not in the habit of revising and correcting as trained architects do. According to Speer, Hitler blindly trusted his initial idea, drawing it as is without hesitation, and this gave the Berghof a personal touch, but also several functional errors. Its layout, he said, would have received a very low grade in any technical school. Even so, this disorder gave it the authentic air of an oversized weekend house. The architect Alois Degano was not mentioned by Speer, but he did play a role in the technical execution. Although the new building was constructed with modern materials, its exterior imitated the traditional style of wood and plaster. A low wing to the east was reminiscent of stables attached to country houses. Hitler apparently felt attached to the old house and wanted to preserve it for personal, not economic reasons. For many Germans, that house had already become a symbol, and he didn't want to break that emotional connection. The name Berghof, which translates as mountain farm, reinforced that image of modest origins and connection to the countryside. The transformation of Haus Wachenfeld into the Berghof wasn't just a work of architecture. It was a symbolic move, designed to reinforce the image of the leader as a man of the people, simple yet powerful, rooted in the German soil. From that high vantage point, not only the Alps could be seen, messages about what the country's future should look like were also projected. Thus was born the Eagle's Nest, the plan that changed the mountain. By April 1937, Bormann first proposed the idea of erecting a permanent structure on the summit of Kehlstein. Since engineer Todt had suggested that the road should only extend to a point below the peak, Bormann saw no problem in continuing the route to the summit. Since the small tea room on the Muslana had demonstrated Hitler's interest in such projects, Bormann decided that a second tea room should be built, this time at the very top of Kehlstein. This new structure was not only to equal the one on the Muslana, but far surpass it, especially given its extreme location and the spectacular route to reach it. Furthermore, the plan included giving it to Hitler as a 50th birthday present on behalf of the Nazi Party. Towards the end of April 1937, Bormann requested a meeting with the architect in charge of all the Obersalzberg works, Professor Roderick Fick. The objective was to discuss the construction of the new Kehlstein tea house. He asked him to submit all the necessary proposals within 1 month. Time was too short, almost impossible. The buildings had to follow an aesthetic line that would not interfere with the beauty of the landscape. Rather, they had to fit in with the surroundings naturally, without clashing. On June 8, 1937, Professor Fick presented the preliminary design for the tea house to Bormann. He opted for a sturdy, square building made of granite. Its design harmonized with the mountainous surroundings. The main hall would have an octagonal shape and large windows with open views. This same idea had already been used in the design of the Muslana tea house. Another separate hall would have a direct view of the Scharitzkel Valley and Lake Königssee. But the idea that the road would only reach the base of the mountain suddenly changed. Now it was necessary to climb to the top to facilitate the transport of materials to the construction site. To resolve this, all the engineers involved met again on June 22, 1937, to conduct another review of the Kehlstein terrain. First, they decided to completely cancel construction of the section between Platterhof, Ludwigshöhe and Rabenwand. That road, which was already somewhat underway, would be covered with rubble so that no trace would remain. From then on, all attention was focused on the Hintereck, Riemertiefe, Unterer Kehlalm route. Dr. Todt proposed changing the direction of the route. Instead of continuing north from Sappenkreuz, he proposed a complete 180-degree turn that would include excavating the road directly into the south face of the mountain. From that point, a tunnel would be built, leading to an underground elevator. This would allow access to the hall at the summit. Although the state engineers initially preferred the original plan, which ended in a natural plateau, they now began to support the new proposal for a tunnel with an elevator. Another review of the site took place on July 12, 1937. Dr. Todt, Professor Fick and Bormann participated. At that meeting, the proposal submitted by the state engineers was finally approved. A few days later, when Fick submitted the estimated costs for the tunnel and elevator, he received what was now customary on the Obersalzberg, an angry outburst from Bormann. Those who had been involved in the project for some time knew that their reactions were part of the process. Bormann immediately ordered the road extended to the summit, scrapping the tunnel plan. It fell to engineer Hauptner very cautiously to try to change his mind. During the conversation with Bormann, Hauptner explained certain facts that made him reconsider. He pointed out that building the entire road to the summit would cost the same or even more than the tunnel with an elevator. Furthermore, the soil on the southern slope was very unstable and would be risky for a road. The slope was so steep that any construction error could lead to serious accidents. He also argued that extending the road would require moving tons of stone and earth, which would affect the appearance of the landscape, something Bormann had initially urged against. He added that the tunnel with an elevator would not only be safer and faster to build, but would also allow the mountain's natural appearance to remain intact, without making visible cuts in the rock. Bormann listened to everything in silence and finally agreed. The elevator and tunnel would be built as suggested, and the road would reach a specific point from where visitors could continue along this vertical path hidden within the mountain. From then on, the project gathered speed. Work shifts were established without a break, all plans were reviewed, and very tight deadlines were set. The pressure was constant. Although the gift was symbolic, the commission had political weight. It wasn't just a mountain house, it was a display of power, technical mastery, and personal greatness. The Kehlstein house wasn't born out of an architectural whim, but rather a strategic calculation of image and propaganda. At the top of the mountain range, the structure was to rise not just as a structure, but as a clear sign of who was at the pinnacle of power. The hidden elevator in the mountain, the most risky part of the project. The Polensky and Zollner firm delegated the Reck brothers, tunnel experts from South Tyrol, the task of opening the passages connecting the main tunnel and the elevator shaft. Their experience in underground excavations was well known among specialists in the field. The initial design was carried out by Professor Roderick Fick, who already managed the interior and exterior works on the Obersalzberg. On September 27, 1937, work began on the service tunnel. Initial supervision was carried out by state engineers. By October 1st, Fick requested that this task be transferred directly to his team. He argued that this tunnel was linked to the construction of the tea house and therefore fell under his control. 2 weeks later, his office took over. By then, the tunnel was about 100 meters long, and the elevator shaft had already been drilled to a depth of 15 meters from the top down. Christmas Eve in 1937 was not a peaceful one for the state engineers. They received a letter from Bormann requesting once again to take charge of the tunnel, the shaft, and the waiting room. After visiting the site, he considered progress to be very slow. On January 8, 1938, the transfer of responsibility was formalized. That same day, representatives of the construction companies met with Fick, Dr. Tott, and Tea House's chief engineer, Alfred Reinhardt, to resolve several outstanding issues. No complete record of what was discussed remains, but one of the central points would have been the logistics of transporting materials. To meet deadlines, the main orders for progress with the main tunnel, the shaft, the waiting room, and the service tunnel were given directly on site. As the official plans were not ready until February, many decisions were made on a day-to-day basis. Although Reinhardt strove to keep pace, the pressure on the workers increased. During the winter, new tasks arose. It was decided that the elevator should have a capacity for 15 people instead of 10. This necessitated enlarging the shaft to a surface area of 23 square meters. Rooms for emergency engines and generators also had to be built 40 meters deep inside the mountain. A tunnel parallel to the main one, connected to these technical rooms, was also required. Construction progressed in 3 shifts a day without stopping. Access to the tunnel was blocked twice by landslides. On May 4, 1938, the shaft drilling was completed and the floor company began installing the elevator. The final depth was 126 meters, with a minimum vertical deviation of just 3 centimeters. To correct this difference, a coating layer of special plaster was applied. The waiting room was built with Ruhpolding marble. Its vaulted ceiling, 6.5 meters high, was assembled without using cement between the stones. To allow for this interior height, the tunnel excavation had to be 9.5 meters deep. The walls of the passageway were faced with Kalberstein marble blocks placed 2 centimeters apart. The spaces were filled with red mortar, the same shade as the stone. According to Fick's design, the tunnel entrance and the nearby octagonal hall were clad with Untersberger marble. The exterior walls at the tunnel exit took advantage of the natural support of the mountain. The structural part of the service tunnel, parallel to the main tunnel, was made of cement. The sections connecting the shaft to the technical rooms were left in solid rock. The cavern used for the generators was insulated with zinc-coated corrugated metal sheets. The waiting room and the intermediate vault were waterproofed with special adhesive insulation. The entire structure was protected from moisture with more treated corrugated metal sheets. The elevator system was supported by a complex pulley system that allowed loads to be moved during excavation. The shaft was drilled from above and below simultaneously. To prevent the summit from collapsing, low-power explosives were used. The rubble was removed by wagon to a nearby depot. One worker died during the construction, but the details were never released. However, there were no other serious casualties, a rarity for a project of this magnitude. To keep the workforce motivated, the companies distributed free beer every day. The elevator's underground system included a fuel room, a transformer room, a control room, emergency diesel generators, and a waiting area. This entire network was connected to the tunnel entrance just below the parking area. In total, the tunnel network ran for over 100 meters before reaching the elevator. One of the biggest challenges arose from the weather. The temperature inside the tunnel was maintained at 7 degrees Celsius. When temperatures rose outside, the cold air condensed moisture on the walls. Bormann ordered a heating system installed immediately. Engineer Weber was responsible for the design, which included large fans to draw fresh air through the service tunnel and channel warm air through electric ducts. The system was implemented by the firm Danneberg and Quandt. By August 1938, 11 air vents were installed between the tunnels. Work continued with many difficulties, from poorly positioned ducts to a lack of space for technicians. Despite all this, the structure was completed on time. The roof of the Third Reich, this is how the Eagle's Nest was built. The Hochtief Company began work on the foundations of the new hall at the top of Kehlstein in mid-February 1938. Since the terrain at the summit was too narrow, part of the rock had to be removed to lay the foundation. Bormann entrusted the task to engineer Alfred Reinhardt, working under Professor Roderick Fick. The workers were stationed at the Kehlstein camp, about 200 meters below the summit. Smaller shelters were also built right on the summit to provide shelter for the shift workers. At the same time, the capacity of the cable system that transported materials was expanded. The top station was installed right next to the elevator entrance. The exact dimensions of the building were marked with stakes directly on the summit and later shown to Bormann. The heavy granite stones for the facade, already cut and ready since November of the previous year in a quarry in Passau, were raised one by one using the overhead cable car. The Philipp Holzmann Company, under the direction of engineer Hans Führer, was responsible for placing them according to the original design. The number of workers working on what was known as Germany's highest construction site was enormous. Carpenters, tilers, floor elevator technicians, bricklayers and assistants shared the cramped space. To prevent accidents in this dangerous area, warning signs and barriers were installed throughout the site. Despite all this, no serious injuries were reported during this phase of the construction. The hall was designed with a timber frame, but the building was mostly made of concrete, especially in the main area. Both the interior and exterior walls were clad with stone, giving it a solid appearance as if made entirely of natural rock. The stones for the facade came from a quarry near Hausenberg in Lower Bavaria. Inside, stone floors, wood paneling, recessed lighting, and heavy furniture were installed, all with materials chosen for their strength and appearance. The dome of the main hall was designed to let in natural light from above, while panoramic windows offered a clear view of the Berchtesgaden Valley and Lake Königssee. Throughout the process, work was carried out around the clock. Nighttime tasks were performed with minimal lighting. The pressure to finish on time was constant. Many of the workers lived in harsh conditions with little rest and had to climb steep paths to base camp. The elevator, already under construction in parallel, had a two-level cabin. The upper section was used for passengers, while the lower section brought supplies from the base to the tea house. The design of the system allowed both to share the same vertical axis without interference. The interior structure combined functionality and propaganda. Every element of the building was designed not only to withstand the extreme climate, but also to convey power. The floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the landscape as if it were a visual conquest. The hall, clad in stone and wood, blended the rustic with the monumental. One of the key moments was the final installation of the exterior walls. The stones were hoisted by hand-operated cranes and then carefully aligned with precision instruments. Plans detailed every joint and angle, and everything had to fit to the millimeter. The interior furnishings also reflected this approach. The tables, chairs, and benches were made of solid wood, hand-carved and tailored to the exact dimensions of the space. The hall could accommodate up to 30 guests at a time. The kitchen, located at the rear, was equipped only for heating food or serving coffee and tea, as most of the food arrived from the Berghof in thermal containers. The hall also included a room called the Scharitzkielzimmer, paneled with Swiss stone pine. Its windows could be lowered to give a direct view of the surrounding mountains. Furthermore, the design allowed the entire building to withstand strong winds and snowfall without structural damage. The hall was officially handed over to the Obersalzberg administration on August 31, 1938. Construction lasted exactly 10 months. In March 1939, Bormann organized a meeting with the construction managers where coffee was served as an informal celebration. That same year, the interior was decorated with expensive objects. Wool rugs, bronze chandeliers, thick curtains, and uniquely designed porcelain tableware were included as part of the furnishings. Some pieces were designed by luxury brands from Munich and Berlin. The total cost of the project, including construction and decoration, was estimated at over 6 million Reichsmarks. Hitler visited the site for the first time on September 16, 1938. Although the interior was not yet completely finished, Bormann wanted to show him the finished product. Hitler complained about the thin air caused by the altitude and the exposed location. Despite this, he returned several times with political guests and members of his closest circle. Among them were Speer, Goebbels, Himmler, Ribbentrop, and the Italian minister Ciano. The Eagle's Nest, as it would later be known, was not intended solely as a tea house. It was a visible symbol, an architectural statement in stone erected at the highest point of Nazi power. The road to the impossible, how it was built. The Kehlstein Road was completed in October 1938. Its construction, along with that of the tea house, was considered a masterpiece of engineering. Even today, it is hailed as a key breakthrough in the history of mountain road construction. It was the first time that hot liquid asphalt was used on an Alpine road with a 25% gradient. To ensure the structure could withstand extreme weather conditions, layers of stone were used to prevent ice from forming at the base. Furthermore, it was designed to withstand the weight of heavy vehicles. Since 1960, the road is estimated to have supported more than 4 million tons of tourist and bus traffic. The support walls were built with several layers of reinforced stone. Over time, only minor failures have been detected. One of the most serious cases occurred in 1999 when a landslide caused an entire section to collapse. Fortunately, there was no traffic at the time. The highlight of the project was the way the road and its embankments were integrated with the natural surroundings. The concept was developed by Professor Alwin Seifert and applied for the first time in this project. Over the years, the edges of the road were completely covered with vegetation, making the route blend into the landscape. Only the road itself remained visible. The volume of work was much greater than expected. Steep slopes, unstable terrain, bad weather, and conflicts with construction companies jeopardized the deadline. Despite everything, the target date of September 1938 was met. Meeting the time and technical requirements was an exceptional achievement, although it came at a high cost. Physical exhaustion, constant tension, and a loss of relationships between those responsible. During the final stage, guardrails were installed, unstable areas were filled with cement, and the slopes were leveled with topsoil brought in by wagon. On the section known as Sidenars, the original idea of making a loop inside the tunnel was abandoned because a different layout better suited the terrain. That decision entailed redoing several sections to avoid sharp turns. The asphalt work was affected by continuous rain. The area took weeks to dry. Parallel to the asphalt, turf was laid along the edges to stabilize the soil. In addition, thousands of loose stones that could mar the appearance of the completed path were removed. In the Offnerkirchel section, a rock avalanche destroyed the newly installed safety fence. To protect that section in the future, a natural stone wall was erected. Another technical challenge was securing the path from the parking lot to the summit. To prevent it from collapsing, it was asphalted and covered with a hard layer. An area affected by a landslide beneath the Dalsenwinkel path was also reinforced. At that point, 3 springs were diverted and a retaining wall was built. Communications facilities were also damaged. A lightning strike destroyed the telephone line between the Sappenkreuz and the parking area. It had to be removed, reburied, and re-turfed. This task was carried out at the same time as the final adjustments to the tunnels and waiting room were being completed. The state engineers were also to be responsible for the connecting section between Point 22 and the Ligeretalm, as well as other auxiliary roads. However, Bormann ordered that the Kehlstein main road be given priority. The workload doubled. All sections of the route, from the Gegenbachriese to the final parking area, were divided between engineers Schenk, Müller and Weber. Engineer Schenk was assigned the section between Salzburgblick and Giggenbach-Riesse. His deadline was brought forward twice. First, the accumulated debris had to be removed, the route redrawn, and the road width widened. The poorly constructed walls were demolished and rebuilt, the foundations reinforced, and several rock sections stabilized with new walls. All of this was done in less time than expected. After completing his part, he was promoted to chief administrator of the Obersalzberg. Engineer Weber was in charge of the final section, which was to be completed in the fall of 1937. Much still remained to be done, filling with gravel, reinforcing the edges, installing railings, preparing the concrete base, and installing drainage. The Platterhof Resten crossing also had to be redesigned, which involved building a bridge. Sager and Werner was contracted for that task. The engineers sought to reduce costs by directly purchasing topsoil to cover the slopes. When they began distributing it, they realized the environmental damage caused in the surrounding areas. In contrast, in the areas under Schenk's supervision, the vegetation had been barely affected. On the south side, the trees were in poor condition. Some were cut down and others treated with tar to slow their deterioration. Once all the structures were completed, the work camps, scaffolding, storage facilities, portable toilets, telephone poles, electrical cables, air and water pipes, and all the tools used during construction were dismantled. Each area was returned to its original state. In the end, the entire route was paved with asphalt. Thus was completed a project that required extreme coordination, constant work, and tolerance of harsh conditions. The Kehlstein Road was not just an access route, it was a statement of power carved into the mountain. The truth about Hitler and the Eagle's Nest, what he really did there. On September 16, 1938, exactly 7 months before the Eagle's Nest was officially handed over to Hitler for his 50th birthday, he visited the building for the first time. Bormann proudly showed him around, even though the interior was not yet fully decorated. During that first visit, Hitler told Bormann that, due to the thin air at the top, he would only be able to go occasionally. He also suffered from vertigo and was afraid of heights. He felt the underground elevator posed a risk. He was particularly concerned about the exposed location of the engine room on the building's roof, where he thought lightning could easily strike during storms. In fact, the building had been struck by lightning twice during construction, causing significant damage. Bormann avoided telling him all the details. He feared that this would be the last time Hitler set foot on the top of Kehlstein. Hitler regretted not being able to show the site to British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who had visited the site the day before for a meeting at the Berghof. Over the following year, Hitler visited the Eagle's Nest several times with politicians and members of his inner circle. Some of those who accompanied him were Inspector General Fritz Todt, SS leader Heinrich Himmler, Italian Foreign Minister Count Ciano, Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, Armaments Minister Albert Speer, Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels, Bavarian leader Adolf Wagner, Labour Front leader Robert Ley, French Ambassador André-François Poncet, and Italian Crown Princess Marie-José. Despite the investment and complexity of the site, Hitler never used it as a residence or official office. He mostly visited only to receive guests or for brief meetings. In reality, his presence at the nest was very limited. In total, 14 official visits were documented between 1938 and 1940. After the outbreak of war, only one more was recorded on October 17, 1940, when he was accompanied by Princess Marie-José. There are also records of 3 unofficial visits, but the exact total is unknown. What is certain is that the Eagle's Nest was not a regular haunt for Hitler. He far preferred the Berghof, located lower in the same region, where he felt more comfortable and spent long periods there. One of the reasons he avoided the Kehlstein house was his fear of the elevator, which he considered dangerous, and the climate at the top. The thin air caused him physical discomfort, and the thought of being at such an altitude unsettled him. The building's exposed location made him feel vulnerable, especially during storms. In March 1939, Bormann organized a meeting with the construction managers of the Eagle's Nest and the highway for coffee in the building. On that occasion, the house was officially handed over to the Obersalzberg administration, although they had actually taken possession of the site since August 31st of the previous year. The interior design of the tea house included a large reception room with sand-blasted oak paneling, a dining room with seating for 30 people, and a kitchen equipped with Kreft appliances, although this was rarely used. Food was brought from the Berghof hotel in thermal containers. The on-site facilities were only used for heating drinks and serving coffee. The room known as the Scharitzelzimmer was panelled with Swiss stone pine. It had 2 windows that could be lowered, offering a full view of Hoher Göll and Lake Königssee. During one of his visits, Hitler commented that the U-shaped table arrangement in the main hall was too cold and impersonal. In 1940, the furniture was rearranged. A large 2-piece table made of beech and walnut was installed, commissioned by the Possenbacher Company, at a cost of 1,888 marks. Hitler's office within the nest was never used by him. Despite being fully furnished and connected to direct lines to Berlin, the Nazi leader never occupied it as a workspace. His presence there was purely symbolic. There are also photographic records showing some private visits. In a rare image, Hitler is seen making one of his only unofficial appearances at the tea house. In another instance, Eva Braun's sister Gretel celebrated her wedding there to SS General Hermann Fegelein in June 1944. Despite the war context, the event was filmed and followed by a small banquet. Hitler did not attend. The food, as was customary, was brought from the Berghof. The building never served any military or strategic purpose. Despite the myths surrounding it, the Eagle's Nest was neither a command center nor an air raid shelter. It was more of a propaganda symbol than a true operational base. In fact, many regime officials, such as Albert Speer, considered the project unnecessary and impractical. Hitler himself often downplayed its importance in private conversations, saying he preferred the tranquility of the Berghof, where he could think and write more calmly. The Eagle's Nest, despite its views and architecture, was never more than a place of passage. Today, the building is a tourist attraction, but at the time it was a little-used stage, uncomfortable for its owner. The regime's most expensive construction, erected high on a mountain, ended up being ignored by the man for whom it was designed. The Mountain Man, the propaganda that built the Hitler myth in the Alps. In 1933, barely after assuming office as head of the German government, Hitler began to be photographed not in Berlin, but in his mountain home on the Obersalzberg. That same year, a book was published entitled The Adopted Homeland of Adolf Hitler, which combined drawings of pristine landscapes, simple wooden houses, and scenes of tranquil mountain life. The author, Karl Schuster-Winkelhoff, was a local resident and had received permission to enter the home and draw even the Nazi leader's personal quarters. The illustrations depicted wide valleys and snow-capped peaks. One image portrayed Berchtesgaden as seen from the path Hitler took on the way up. The intention was for the reader to feel part of that vision. The book, with its thick paper and small format, resembled a travelogue, but it served as propaganda. Its centerpiece was the Wachenfeld house, which would soon become a symbol of purity, order, and the closeness of Nazi power. At the same time, official photographer Heinrich Hoffmann published images of Hitler feeding deer, playing with children, or greeting villagers. These scenes were intended to show him as a simple man, surrounded by nature, without luxuries, and connected to ordinary people. For the National Socialist media, the Mountain House was not just a home. It represented an ideal of life promised to the people: clean air, abundant food, loyal dogs, happy children, and kind neighbors. Whoever bought a postcard of the house or a picture of the leader on his balcony not only showed admiration but symbolically participated in that vision of a strong, united country in harmony with its surroundings. Some visitors traveled miles to reach the gates of Haus Wachenfeld. Even when Hitler was not present, the sight of the house alone justified the trip. It was an emotional point of reference. For many, it was the place where the future they had been promised would begin. Propaganda repeated that there, amid the Alpine silence, Hitler found inspiration. It was said that in this peaceful setting he had devised his most important plans. Photographs showed him gazing at the mountains, surrounded by snow, his face serious. He was no longer the smiling politician of the campaign trail, but the thoughtful leader contemplating the nation from above. Hitler's poses mimicked 19th-century German Romantic paintings. In them, a solitary figure, with his back turned, gazes at the immense landscape. Hitler, on the other hand, always appeared head-on, recognizable. He was not an ordinary man admiring nature, but someone who seemed to dominate it with his mere presence. The films of the 1920s and 1930s also reinforced this message. Directors like Arnold Fanck and Louis Trenker depicted the Alps as a place of physical strength, struggle, purity, and self-improvement. The camera emphasized the extreme beauty of the landscapes as if they were sacred settings. Nazi propaganda took that image and adapted it. Hitler was not just part of the landscape, he was its master. Unlike Romantic art, which showed respect for the grandeur of nature, the Nazis taught that nature was at the service of the leader. The Kehlstein house, built atop an impossible peak, reflected this thought. It was a work that defied the terrain, a gesture of dominance. The famous Berghof window, where Hitler appeared with the Untersberg in the background, became one of the most recognizable images of the regime. Other people never appeared in those photos, not because they weren't there, but because they would have been minimized by the scale of the background. The shots were carefully crafted to ensure the leader's size was proportional to the mountain, as if both shared the same hierarchy. Hitler was also shown inspecting construction sites alongside the engineer Fritz Todt, marking out paths or inspecting tunnels. It was a way of saying that technology, far from disrupting the natural order, improved it. In another, softer version, we saw him feeding animals or playing with children, reinforcing the idea of a just and trustworthy man. The Berghof was presented as the goal after all the hard work. A propaganda book read, "Berchtesgaden, the leader's destination after weeks of hard work." That phrase marked not only a location but also a promise. Whoever fought would also find rest in fertile land. In many images, Hitler would step out onto the balcony or walk along the terrace. He would gaze toward the horizon without speaking. His figure was linked to concepts such as renewal, inner peace, spiritual nourishment, and a sense of duty. Even the bread and butter his sister Angela prepared was part of that symbolic world. Everything was intimate, simple, and natural. Propaganda repeated that he slept better there, thought clearly, and surrounded himself with his loved ones. Visits to the Obersalzberg were seen almost as pilgrimages. People would crowd around the railings to see him pass, touch his hand, or receive a word. In some photos, an elderly woman greets him with her arm raised while holding her purse tightly. In others, Hitler leans toward a smiling little girl. These scenes sold the idea that anyone could have a moment with the leader. However, this image of closeness concealed a harsher reality. The original residents were ruthlessly displaced. Some accepted money, others were forced. There were threats of being sent to concentration camps if they resisted. In winter, roofs were even removed to speed up the move. But none of this appeared on the postcards or propaganda books. The myth was carefully constructed. Through repeated images, a homely, human, rural Hitler was presented, in balance with the land. This fantasy became commodified. Albums, trading cards, cigarettes, postcards. It was more than propaganda. It was a way of selling hope, even if it was false. The day the Allies crushed the Obersalzberg. On April 25, 1945, a fleet of 359 British Royal Air Force Lancaster bombers, accompanied by 16 Mosquito fighter bombers and 88 P-51 Mustang escort aircraft, flew over the Obersalzberg. The attack was carried out in two waves. The first occurred between 9:51 and 10:11 a.m., the second between 10:42 and 11 a.m. The peak intensity was between 10 a.m. and 10:58 p.m. The operation was organized after the discovery of an underground network in the area. The objective was to demolish it with bombs designed to penetrate concrete. In total, they dropped 1,232 tons of explosives. Among them were several tallboy bombs, 6-ton bombs designed to explode underground. The official order was to destroy the supposed Nazi Alpine bastion, a mountain fortress where Hitler and his followers reportedly planned to entrench themselves to continue the war from the Alps. The area of the Berghof and the Kehlstein house, where Hitler's, Göring's and Bormann's homes were located, was designated a military target for its symbolic and logistical significance. The Obersalzberg's anti-aircraft defenses were already weakened. The experienced gunners had been transferred to the front months earlier. The few remaining operators were inexperienced. They fired only a few disorganized shots before falling silent. Thousands of people managed to take refuge in the underground bunkers. Despite the massive bombardment, the death toll was low. However, civilian casualties were confirmed, including children trapped in open spaces. The Berghof was hit by several bombs. The east and west sides burned for hours. The roof of the house, which covered the Great Hall and Hitler's apartments, collapsed. The original section, known as Haus Wachenfeld, was completely torn open after a close call. Inside, the floor was covered in debris and the furniture was destroyed. According to his secretary, Christa Schroeder, the new part of the building was rendered uninhabitable. Although the media reported that the house had been reduced to dust, many sections remained standing. The East Wing and part of the Great Hall held. However, days later, on May 4th, SS members still in the area doused the Berghof with gasoline and set it on fire, completing its destruction. The Kehlstein house, meanwhile, was not hit. Despite being one of the targets, no bombs found their mark. Its small size, estimated at about 17 square meters, made a direct hit difficult. The accumulated snow hampered visibility, and many crews failed to locate their intended targets. 10 of the squadron's 16 units diverted or aborted their part of the mission. The Göring and Bormann houses, the Czech workers' camp, and the shelter for evacuated children were hit, although they were not among the priority targets. The SS barracks, on the other hand, did receive a direct hit. Several tall boys landed right on the complex, completely pulverizing it. Reports from the ground paint a less accurate picture than what British Air Command had stated. Mountains blocked radio signals, and reflections off the snow made it difficult to see the buildings. Some bombs were dropped blindly or in the wrong areas. 2 Lancasters were shot down by anti-aircraft fire. 4 crew members were killed and the others were captured, only to be freed by the advancing Allies. The next day, newspaper headlines celebrated the action. One described a massive flash right on Hitler's house, claiming it had been wiped off the map. However, later reports showed this was not the case. The bombing failed to completely eliminate the symbol, but it did send a powerful message. From the air, the destruction was evident. From the ground, it was even more so. Photographer Richard Reiter, who had handed documents to the SS just before the attack, was one of the first to see the wreckage. Göring's house looked like a blasted-out cave. On the ground, he found silver objects and decorated knives. Then he approached the Berghof, where he saw burned art folders. He picked up one with drawings by Michelangelo, packed it in his suitcase, and left. Correspondents present described scenes of looting. French and American soldiers fought over trophies. They stole silverware, vases, and paintings. Some drank and celebrated amid the ruins. Almost nothing remained for museums. The most iconic place of the Nazi regime now burned to a crisp, crumbled into portable souvenirs. Officially, the attack was justified as a psychological blow. The Berghof represented Hitler's symbolic heart. Demolishing it was a way of killing him in the minds of the German people, even if he wasn't there. The idea was to cut off any hope of resistance from the mountains. General Eisenhower defined it as the symbol of Nazi arrogance. Seeing it in tatters, he said, offered clear satisfaction. The operation closed the air war in Europe for the Royal Air Force. One of the navigators summed up the squadron's feeling upon landing. This was the mission we had been waiting for from day one. Over the years, some historians and pilots questioned the tactical value of the attack, the improvisation, the chaos in the air, and the timing, with the war already decided, leave doubts. Even so, the symbolic effect was enormous. The image of the burning Berghof appeared in magazines and newspapers as the visible end of the regime, the Allied takeover that ended Nazi control of the mountains. On the night of May 3, 1945, the 5th Parachute Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division received orders to move toward Berchtesgaden. They were to be ready by 6 in the morning with heavy ammunition and supplies. Their mission was to take the Obersalzberg, where high-ranking officials of the Third Reich were believed to be hiding. They advanced along the highway, accompanied by Company A of the 321st Field Artillery Battalion, a platoon from the 81st Anti-Aircraft Battalion, and 4 guns from the 377th Battalion. The group crossed the Inn River near Rosenheim and headed for Siegsdorf and Inzell. There they encountered the French Armoured Division under the command of General Jacques-Philippe Leclerc. The SS had blown up a key bridge on the Alpine route. Without engineering equipment, the French were stranded. The American paratroopers then began constructing a Bailey Bridge under enemy fire from 2 positions on the mountain. A group scaled the slope to neutralize the snipers. Only then could the march continue. Colonel Sink, commanding the group, knew that more bridges could have been destroyed, which would delay the offensive. He therefore ordered the 2nd Battalion to retreat and seek an alternate route through Reichenhall. There they encountered units of the 3rd Infantry Division, which were also trying to arrive before anyone else. The 3rd Division commander, General John W. O'Daniel, personally halted the 2nd Battalion. The message that reached the Allied headquarters summed up the situation. Everyone wants to get into Berchtesgaden. The location was coveted for its symbolism. Although the war was decided, taking Hitler's refuge was an act of historical significance. On the morning of May 4th, a forward detachment of the 7th Infantry Regiment crossed an old railroad bridge and occupied part of Salzburg. Meanwhile, the 1st Battalion, under Colonel John A. Heintges, took a mountain pass and descended toward the Obersalzberg. They arrived at 3:58 p.m. 10 minutes later, the 3rd Battalion entered from the northeast. By then, American flags were already flying over the area. On May 5th, the 7th Regiment raised the American flag at the Berghof. The French wanted to prevent the ceremony. General Leclerc had blocked the approaches to prevent passage. At the last minute, a French colonel proposed raising both the American and French flags. However, the tricolour was so heavy that it fell several times. Finally, the French gave up. At the same time, men of the 3rd Division searched the area. They looted the Berghof, Goering's house, and the bunkers. They found bottles of Pommery champagne, silverware, Meissen porcelain, and crystal glasses. Many objects were torn from the walls, including wood panelling from the Scharitzkil room. The entrance to the elevator in the Eagle's Nest was blocked by snow. German prisoners of war helped clear it days later. Since the elevator was not yet working, the soldiers hiked the path to the Kehlstein house, located at an altitude of 1,834 meters. There, the inventory was almost intact. Only the expensive tapestries were missing. General Maxwell Taylor was one of the first high-ranking officers to visit the house. By the time he arrived, much of the contents had already been stolen by the soldiers themselves. Annoyed, he ordered a permanent guard to be placed at the site. This task was assigned to Colonel Harper, who recorded it in his diary on May 10th. Berchtesgaden was then under American occupation. Nearby hotels housed hundreds of soldiers, enjoying a rest after hard fighting at the front. In addition to the 101st Division, the 327th Regiment also settled in the area. On May 15th, Generals Omar Bradley and Wade Heislip visited the Eagle's Nest, transported in Hitler's armored Mercedes. Army journalists filmed the scene. From that moment on, the Kehlstein house became a tourist destination for Allied officers. Meanwhile, the Berghof, reduced to ruins, was looted by soldiers and civilians. Bottles, documents, and charred remains were still found in its basement. One of the first visitors, photographer Richard Reiter, collected drawings by Michelangelo and silver jugs. Guided tours were organized in the village for the new occupants. Signs pointed the way to Hitler's house. Soldiers handed out maps. One correspondent wrote that it looked like a theme park, with soldiers and nurses strolling, taking photos and looking for souvenirs. The Berghof tunnels, closed to the public, remained guarded. Although the looting had been massive, traces of the regime remained. Bunkers, passageways, warehouses. Some tried to enter on their own, others were content to watch from the outside. A few days later, high-ranking officers gave the order to protect the ruins and prevent them from becoming a place of pilgrimage, but the damage had been done. Hitler's refuge had fallen. Foreign flags flew on his mountain. The final scene of the war in Europe had already been written. Secrets in the basement, what the ruins hid. By mid-April 1945, it appeared that the Obersalzberg might be beyond the reach of the final bombing raids and fighting. With German resistance collapsing, American and French troops advanced toward Berchtesgaden. On April 16th, Allied aircraft destroyed the last functional remnants of the Luftwaffe, nearly 900 planes on the ground, without pilots or fuel. That night, General Karl Spaatz declared the strategic air war over. The new focus would be to support the ground advance until total surrender was achieved. The bombing of the Berghof on April 25th came as a surprise to many. What was the point of destroying a symbolic refuge with the war almost over? Previous attacks on the Obersalzberg had been cancelled. Some doubted the wisdom of eliminating Hitler at this point, considering his poor command benefited the Allies. Others feared that if he survived, the German people would rally even closer to him. After the destruction, a wave of looting broke out. What the bombers didn't pulverize, the soldiers tore away. Hitler's house didn't disappear, it was cut into pieces, moved to basements and living rooms around the world. Vogue correspondent Lee Miller arrived at the Berghof on the night of May 4th. It was still burning. By morning, he said, the fire was almost out, and the looters too, but en masse. French and American troops, who had vied for the honor of arriving first, were now cooperating in search of souvenirs. Miller described a wild party amid the smoking ruins with toasts, shouts, and objects passed from hand to hand. There was nothing left for a museum about this war criminal, he noted ironically. All over the planet, he said, napkin rings and forks would appear in civilian homes supposedly used by Hitler. The Obersalzberg was presented as a surreal landscape of extreme luxury. That morning, young SS courier Richard Reiter was called to deliver a package to the detachment commander on the mountain. Upon arrival, the sirens began to wail. He hid in a shelter by Goering's swimming pool. When he emerged, his house resembled a cave blown out. Among the rubble, he found a silver Persian plate and a hunting knife decorated with stones. He took them with him. Along the way, he picked up an art folder flying near the Berghof. He would later discover it contained reproductions of Michelangelo. In that same chaos, American soldiers found an intact wine cellar filled with wines and champagnes from around the world. Paratrooper David Webster recounted it this way. They were drinking liquor with one hand and filling crates with the other. Amid candles, shouts, and broken bottles, they celebrated the end of the regime with what they had found. Thus, the image of the modest and austere Hitler that propaganda had sold for years collapsed. While the Americans took the wine, the French preferred durable objects. They had found a tunnel where the dictator's furniture, crockery, linens, and cutlery was stored. They took them without hiding. Some Americans did so as well. Photos of them posing with the trophies would later be seen in their homes. Although officially the looting was illegal, many high-ranking officers tolerated it or even participated. A colonel in Texas threw a party using Hitler's tablecloths and cutlery. The occupation of the Berghof by Allied troops revealed a network of tunnels, vaults, and bunkers. While the ruins burned above ground, hundreds of objects and food remained underground. Local residents, seeing their opportunity, raced there with wheelbarrows, horses, and bicycles to take as much as possible. Sugar, butter, honey, coffee, clothing, and crockery. Near Bormann's refuge, they came across huge stockpiles of champagne and cognac. Shortly afterward, the troops found a collection of looted art. They set up an impromptu exhibition in the Bavarian Hotel in Unterstein. Works by Rembrandt, Cranach, Rubens, Holbein, and Renoir were piled up in rooms with no smoking signs. The curator of Goering's collection, Walter Andreas Hofer, explained the pieces to the visitors, insisting that everything had been acquired legally. The soldiers didn't believe him. Some paintings disappeared during the exhibition. Albums containing stolen works that Hitler kept for his mountain home were also discovered. More evidence was found at Neuschwanstein Castle. In June, the press reported that the army had found a stash of Nazi treasure valued at $5 billion. It included gold bars, jewelry, religious artifacts, and Reich bonds. The looting also revealed horrors. In Frankfurt, the central bank was used to store the looting. There were sacks of banknotes, barrels of jewels and pearls, and chests containing dental gold extracted from Jewish victims. Ropes containing the wedding rings of murdered women completed the scene. Meanwhile, journalists toured the remains of the Berghof. Louis Lochner, who had interviewed Hitler before the war, returned to the Obersalzberg. He compared the refuge to a medieval fortress. He described each room in detail, the sandstone main hall, the dining room with Meissen porcelain, and the enormous stained glass windows. In the tunnels, he found collections of 1,832 wines and rare French champagnes. Lochner concluded that all this shattered the myth of the modest home. The Berghof ruins not only depicted opulence, but also crime. They transformed the site into a kind of legend, a place of secrets underground, where perhaps even more treasures lay hidden. The shadow left behind the troubled legacy of the Eagle's Nest. By the end of the war, it was clear that the Obersalzberg would never be what it had been. The Nazis had destroyed centuries of mountain history to build a military complex filled with barracks, tunnels, defenses, and luxurious mansions for their leadership. The Allied bombing of April 25, 1945, completely altered the landscape, uprooting trees, opening new craters and leaving roads impassable. Despite this, in the summer of that same year, a journalist for the Christian Science Monitor reported that Hitler's retreat resembled an amusement park, with thousands of tourists signing autographs on the charred walls. The Obersalzberg, once hidden, became a free attraction. The attraction was no longer the fresh air and the Alpine views, but the thrill of visiting the tyrant's remains. For the locals, this meant revenue. For the authorities, it was a problem. In May 1945, the US military occupation began, a period that would last 5 decades. That summer, the US Army's Special Services Division organized recreational activities for soldiers who were no longer in combat but couldn't yet return. One of the most visited sites was Berchtesgaden. The crowd included soldiers, nurses, senators, generals, and even artists. A sign at the entrance read, "Hitler's House." One journalist described how a corporal from the 101st Airborne Division handed out maps and warned against climbing the Eagle's Nest in fog because you could throw a jeep into the void on a sharp turn. Another recounted that upon reaching the summit on a clear day, the landscape was lavender with black shadows. One soldier compared it to a Disney movie. The house was intact, with no signs of war, as if Hitler could return at any moment. "The only difference," joked one officer, "is that Adolf doesn't live here anymore." The Berghof tunnels also held fascination. Although many had already been looted, they still contained furniture, books, tableware, and personal belongings. Price Day, a correspondent for the Baltimore Sun, toured them alone in June 1945. He described feeling strangely alone and got lost in the aisles. He saw new bookcases filled with encyclopedias, cooking manuals, and even SS crockery. Another visitor tried Hitler's bed and found it uncomfortable. The mix of the everyday and the sinister was most appealing. It was like watching a mythological god sipping tea in slippers before launching lightning bolts. The place was a labyrinth of the macabre and the familiar. The Berghof kitchen was intact, but everyone wanted to see 2 things, the large window of the Great Hall and the Eagle's Nest. Standing there was like imitating the dictator's gaze, sharing his point of view, as Nazi propaganda suggested. Many visitors didn't just look. They wanted to record that they had been there. According to Day, the walls were covered with names, ranks, hometowns, and serial numbers. Only the ceilings were left untouched. It was a way of recording victory. Another reporter called it a symbolic monument to the collapse of the house that Hitler built. Life magazine published before and after photos. The New York Times joked that Hitler's ghost would have to find another place to haunt. However, the tourists never left. Despite attempts to erase the ruins, traffic was so heavy that it prevented the grass from growing over the rubble. The house, although demolished, remained the most visited site in Germany without official promotion. In 1962, a journalist compared it to Pompeii. Years later, a luxury hotel opened in the area. Journalists wondered if it was appropriate to drink wine while looking at the same landscape that inspired Hitler. Hotel staff received training on how to talk about the Nazi past. In each room there was a Bible and a catalogue from the documentation center with photos of the Holocaust. Some guests found the reading uncomfortable, and the books were moved to the library. The hotel protected itself against neo-Nazi gatherings by raising prices and banning reservations on April 20th, Hitler's birthday. At the same time, a global market for the dictator's personal belongings emerged. Selling them is legal in the United States and the United Kingdom, but prohibited in Germany. Cutlery, sheets, desks, lamps, and even a globe were auctioned. Many were fakes. Public sales drew criticism from Jewish groups who saw them as a way to profit from the genocide. One Jewish collector declared, "You killed my family, but now I own you." Museums almost never display these objects. In 2010, the German Historical Museum organized an exhibition on Hitler and the German people. They excluded all personal objects because of their potential appeal. Even a sideboard designed by Speer was covered with black mesh to prevent idealized views. It was like placing the objects in visual quarantine. The Bavarian government rebuilt the area, erasing structures from the Third Reich. They demolished the hill where Goering's house stood, razed the last visible remains, and leveled the land for hotels. The Platterhof was turned into a parking lot, and the former SS barracks became a Segway track for tourists. There were protests. Some accused the authorities of trying to minimize the past. Others said that with the last witnesses dying, these ruins were the only physical connection to what happened there. Despite the institutional silence, the surviving ruins continued to receive visitors. On abandoned walls, graffiti such as "Hitler was right" revealed the presence of extremists. For some, the mountain was simply a beautiful place. For others, a place of worship. The Berghof, now without roofs or walls, remained a historical trap.